Hi, everyone. Um, Good evening, and welcome to Broadview's National Online Reading Club. My name is Robert Liwanag, and I am Broadview's Associate Editor. Working behind the scenes to help me out tonight is Meredith Poirier. We're very excited that you've taken an hour from your evening to be here with us. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. Today, Toronto is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. We are honored to be able to work, live, and play on this land. As always, we'd love to know who you are and where you're from. So please consider saying hello from your hometown in the chat. If you're part of a faith community and want to add that as well, please do so. And if you want to add your own land acknowledgement from wherever you are, I invite you to share that as well. As always, a few housekeeping rules before we get started. We are recording this session so we can share this event with others. If you feel uncomfortable with your thumbnail video appearing on this recording, please turn off your video now. Also, please mute your audio or we may have to mute it for you, but do turn on the chat function. So you can just hover your cursor over the bottom of the screen. The chat button will appear and you can just click on it. We also recommend that you use speaker view on Zoom rather than the gallery view. There's a spot to change that in the top right corner of your screen. This evening, we are going to hear from Carol Moskot, Sheima Benembarek, Jonathan Dyck, and Josiah Neufeld, all of whom were featured in or contributed to the April-May issue of Broadview. After our speakers have told us a bit about themselves and their stories, there will be a time to ask questions. Meredith will post our instructions on how to ask questions in the chat space. I have some questions ready, but as you know, this is your time. So we do encourage lots of participation so we can have a vibrant conversation for all. And before we begin, just a gentle reminder to please be respectful of our guests and hosts. Disrespectful or insulting comments that target the guests will not be tolerated. I hope this won't come up, but we just wanted to say just in case. So let's get started. Our first guest is Carol Moskot. Carol is Broadview's art director, and so she leads every aspect of the magazine's overall visual style, layout, and graphic design, including its brand identity and logo. But during this event, she'll be talking about her feature, The Last Letters, which was the cover story of the April-May issue. Please welcome Carol.
Thanks, Robert. So, hi, everybody. My name is Carol Moskot, and I've been the art director of Broadview since its relaunch 5 years ago. And as Robert explained, it's my role to partner with our editors and our writers and find the best way to tell our stories to our readers, you. I begin by reading every story in an issue and working with photographers and illustrators to craft images that speak to the heart of a story. And then I design the entire look and feel of each magazine page, including the cover. So a little bit of background about me. I've worked for publications as art director for magazines such as Toronto Life, Maclean's, and the Globe and Mail. But it was a call I got one day many years ago that changed my life and aligned my job as a visual storyteller with social justice. 25 years ago, approximately, World Vision Canada approached me to redesign and art direct its magazine, Childview, which maybe some of you are familiar with. I loved working on Childview, knowing that I was helping children and their families by telling their stories. But the catalyst for me was the day I received photographs and stories of families and children who survived the Rwandan genocide. I read their stories and accounts. And they sounded so much like the stories my family had shared with me about their experiences of genocide during the Holocaust. And so I knew I'd found my calling within the world of social justice, like basically telling stories for good. Over my 35-year career, I've worked with a wide variety of international clients and on assignment. I've advised clients such as USAID, World Vision, Mercy Corps, Right to Play, Facing History and Ourselves, and Sinta Gleska University, which is a groundbreaking institution in North Dakota on tribal land serving tribal communities centered on the Lakota way of life. It's been very, very fulfilling working with them. A bit about me. My parents came to Toronto as immigrants in the 50s and 60s. And I saw firsthand the powerful positive impact that humanitarian aid and social service organizations had on their lives in post-war Europe. It's my calling to use my talents as an art director, a creative director, and designer to tell mission-driven stories because of what happened to my family during the Holocaust. I was born and raised in Toronto, and I'm the first generation of my family to be born in Canada, in North America. And growing up, our Passover table included me, my parents and sister, along with my grandmother, Elizabeth, her husband and son from a second marriage. 7 people, 7 family members in total. Can't tell you how much I marveled and envied my friends who had 20 people sitting around their Passover table. I grew up in an area called Bathurst Manor in Toronto. At one time, it had the largest group of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. All my neighbors, all my friends' parents were survivors from every country in Europe. And there was an enormous comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone. Each of our stories was very unique. My friend Janet's mother was hidden in a Catholic convent in France as a child. My friend Ricky's mom was in the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland. And my friend Ian's dad was in the Plaszow concentration camp. You might remember that as the one that was featured in Schindler's List. We were child of Holocaust survivors. We shared our stories, and we were a very tight-knit group. Growing up, I hid my Jewishness outside my community. When my father arrived in Canada, he promptly changed his first and last name. And when I asked why, he said it was because he didn't want himself to, or me, essentially, to be a target of Jew hatred. So we hid in plain sight for decades outside of our community. I fondly remember my professor of color theory, Ernst Berenger at the Ontario College of Art and Design, where I went to school, loved to tell us stories about his days in the Hitler Youth movement. And you can bet I never mentioned that I needed to take off Rosh Hashanah for fear of identifying myself as a Jew. Last year, as Holocaust Remembrance Day came around, I took a chance at one of our editorial meetings, and I had just received the 5 postcards from my mom during Passover, and the words "we were once slaves in Egypt" were crushing my heart yet again. And when my editor asked how I was doing at an editorial meeting, I decided to share a tiny snippet of my story, which led to me being asked to write the last letters. Now I'm working on my dad's story and maybe a book, which I hope I can share with you all in the future.
Thank you, Carol, for sharing that. Yeah, if I'm sure this group has lots of questions for you, so I'll give a few minutes for people to type it into the chat, but I can start things off. You've written articles for Broadview before, but nothing that comes to the size and scope of the last letters. What surprised you the most about the writing and research of the story?
What surprised me most? Let me think about that. I guess what surprised me most, what deeply shocked me was how much I thought I knew about what happened to my family and what actually happened to them. Like, it was so much worse than I ever imagined. My ignorance was born out of fear. My parents' stories were terrifying. and grief-stricken nightmares. And for years, I avoided feeling the feels. Writing meant it was time to face my heartache about what happened, and really my mother and my grandmother's heartache kind of face on. But I was endlessly surprised at how little of my own people's history I knew and how little of this history I was taught in school. Like, I had no idea that anti-Jewish laws were written into law in Hungary well before the Nazis shared their ideas about race and carried out the final solution. And the fact that there were many far-right and influential Jew-hating organizations and paramilitary groups in Hungary, back in the 20s. I didn't know that Hungary was allied with Germany. But most surprised, the thing that most surprised me was at how Hungarian Jews, specifically in Budapest, convinced themselves that if they assimilated and identified themselves as Hungarians first and foremost, that the leadership of Hungary would never forget the political, economic, and cultural contributions the Jews had made to the Hungarian nation since the 1848 Austro-Hungarian Revolution. And that's a revolution that my great-great-grandfather fought in for the Hungarians. So I spent a lot of time reading books and studying history and understanding the connection of what was happening in history at that time to make sense of it all. And it's really something my grandmother, Elizabeth, had no capacity to explain. It was really up to me to connect the dots.
Now, Passover begins on Wednesday, and we also have Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day, taking place in Israel in, I think, 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, exactly. On the eve of the 17th to the 18th.
Mm-hmm. Now, how have your family members and friends reacted to this story?
I sent copies to my mother, who was thrilled and sad and completely blown away by the amount of information I was able to find out. She knew a lot, but she didn't know the breadth of what had happened, because she was born in 1943 in the ghetto, and her mother was very, very eager. Her mother, Elizabeth, was eager to move on. I sent copies of the magazine to my grandfather's daughter and her daughter, her granddaughter, so my mother's first cousins, which are the only living relatives my mother has in Boston. And they cried a lot. And they were so thankful to have the story told.
The postcards, along with your conversations with your mother and your grandmother when she was still with you, gave you more insight into sort of, the branches of your family tree. Do you ever envision traveling to Hungary to do more research, or do you think it'll be too painful?
So because of my family history, I've always been an obsessive genealogist. It's kind of my way of piecing my family back together. And in 1996, my great grandmother, Elizabeth's mother, was celebrating her 100th birthday. So I traveled to Budapest for the first time with my mom, and I was able to interview my grandmother, who was visiting as well as Elizabeth, and my great grandmother. So 4 generations in one room. And I was able to spend a lot of time asking Elizabeth about growing up in Budapest. And we toured the streets of the old Jewish ghetto, and Elizabeth showed me the spot on the Danube River where the Hungarian fascists had taken her to be shot. So not a very, a lot of sad stuff. We walked by the old Nazi headquarters, and we saw what still appeared to be white supremacists standing around outside handing anti-Jewish pamphlets. So things really hadn't changed. I really look forward to going back again. I think there's a lot more research to be done, because my father, as a young man, as a teenager, was in Budapest at that very same time. being hidden and working with underground partisans. So I need to go back and explore what happened with his story.
Now we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, this, resurgence of anti-Semitism in North America, where historically, it's had deep roots, and that makes your story all the more relevant. What does it mean to you to be able to publish this story against this, backdrop of hate?
It means everything. I'm so grateful that I'm able to use this story to speak out. I mean, the last letter shows the slow burn of racial hatred, of Jew hatred, how it picks up steam over time and how it trickles down to universities. My grandparents couldn't go to university because they were quotas. It seeps into our newspapers and other media today. Media personalities, who hold racist attitudes are given a platform on social media. And basically all the while we're told, we're overreacting as Jews. No, it's all right. Don't make a big deal about it. And frankly, that's what the Jews of Hungary told each other. There was a sense of complacency, but frankly, I feel the Jews are a canary in a coal mine. That when things are going badly for us, it's not going well for anybody. Modern anti-Semitism is essentially a repackaging of historic tropes. And Jew haters have adopted conspiracy theories of the blood libel, as well as Jewish influence in economic and governmental affairs, to fit new circumstances, such as the accusation that Jews are responsible for spreading COVID-19. And that's, and it's just like the Jews were, accused of spreading the plague a millennium ago. I think hate is passed down from parent to child, and within communities, and within institutions, and within religious and political frameworks. And we kind of learn it's okay to hate others. But my philosophy is the way to counteract hate is through education. And I believe that by examining pivotal moments in history, like the Holocaust, or so many others, like the Rwandan genocide, et cetera, what's happening with, what happened to our indigenous communities, we can learn how the choices made in the past have shaped our present. And I believe history is not inevitable. I think people make choices, and choices make history. So, my advice is that when you hear someone using anti-Jewish language or stereotypes, speak out. If you hear an anti-Semitic joke or a slur, don't be silent, because your silence sends a message that humor is okay. Please urge your spiritual and lay leaders to condemn anti-Semitism. That's kind of my message.
And I think we have time for one more question. Chloe Tejada had a question.
Hi, Carol.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you. So as Robert said previously, we have seen the rise in anti-Semitism here in the West in the past couple of years. And so I think it's so important that these stories are told. And yet it does seem like people aren't being taught a lot about the history of this in schools, and especially with, misinformation, disinformation out there on social media and even traditional media. It's important that we have these articles. So what do you hope really that readers come away with when they read your story, and what else can we do to educate ourselves? What other readings should we be reading right now? And thank you so much for writing it, Carol.
Thank you. Wow, there's a lot I could share. A lot of materials that I could share with you that I don't have with me, but I can make them available online. Chloe, repeat your question, please. What you want?
Yeah. So I was just wondering, what else can we do to educate ourselves? What other readings should we be reading right now with all the misinformation and disinformation out there?
Wow. Gosh, what you should be reading is history. And I'm not saying you should be reading the books that I read, but there is the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Has incredible resources if you go online, and I will enter the information in the chat so that you can go to their site. And the information that they provide as background on the Holocaust and what happened is where you should begin: basic education and history, and starting in the in the early 30s, and exploring how Hitler's rise to fascism and the idea of Jews as a race is thoroughly explained. And I think people know like the big picture of what happened in the Second World War, but they don't know the trickle down. I mean, it wasn't just Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. There were many other faith groups who were killed, and most people assumed that Jews were taken to camps. I mean, large quantities were, but there was a very clear methodology that the Nazis used, and it was a very step-by-step process, and the information wasn't shared from Jewish community to Jewish community from country to country. So understanding how the mechanism worked, how the Nazis worked their way from one country to the other, killing people is important to learn. Sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carol, for having the courage to dig deep into your family history, but also to speak about your story here tonight. I'm not alone in saying that it remains a very powerful and relevant read.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Our second guest is Sheima Benembarek, who is a Moroccan-Canadian writer and the author of the book Halal Sex: The Intimate Lives of Muslim Women in North America, which was published last month. In our latest issue, she was interviewed about why she wanted to write about this subject specifically. Please join me in welcoming Sheima.
Hello, my name is Sheima. I just took a sip of water because it's Ramadan and the sun just set. So my voice might be a little weirder than usual. I started working on this project about 5 years ago, and it's been the most rewarding and the hardest thing I've ever done. I was looking to answer a question. What is it like for Muslim women in Canada and the US when they try to reconcile the sexual freedoms they have here with some of the restrictions of the faith? Is it easier for them than it was for us? And by us, I mean the women who grew up in Muslim majority countries, where sex outside of marriage is punishable by law. In Morocco, for example, you can go to jail for 2 years. In Pakistan, you can get 30 strokes of whipping. And in Saudi Arabia, a death sentence through stoning may be acceptable punishment. I sent out public calls on social media, Reddit, Facebook, and asked to chat about Islam and sex in North America with Muslim women. And I got tons of interest and spoke with dozens and dozens of Muslim women and gender expansive people. And then in the end, in this book, you'll find 6 of them. True accounts of how they have sometimes failed and sometimes succeeded at living the lives they wanted to live as sexual beings. I called the book Halal Sex on purpose. As an expression in Islam, it refers to only sex between a married man and woman as permissible. the word halal just means permissible. I know most people are accustomed to it being with regards to food, but that leaves out many, many other relationship variations that are destined to hellfire. And so I'm using this term as the title in a way to subvert the restrictive concept, because I personally think all sex between consenting adults is halal sex. But if nothing else, I think for those who need it, I would love for this book to keep Muslim women company. Because even if all you have is the privacy of your room and the secrecy of your thoughts, the 6 people in halal sex, at the very least, will be there with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheima. In your interview, you mentioned that discovering Islamic feminist scholars brought you closer to your faith. What pieces of literature inspired you during the making of your book?
Well, there was an uprising sort of feminist women scholars in Islam that were looking at the Quran and the interpretations of the Quran, the Hadith, and all of that with a feminist lens. And I had never been told about them very much as, you know, growing up. And once I came across that concept, and there's writers such as Amina Wadud, Asma al-Murabit, Irshad Manji as well, I was blown away with how open it was for me as a woman, as a Muslim woman, to exist based on the interpretations that they were giving. And the explanation that suddenly made complete sense was how the rules that exist now in Muslim majority countries, but also like the way that, you know, the restrictions get applied in Muslim communities here, for example, were established by 9th century men and their cultural limitations and their experience and their surroundings and all of that. And so it didn't occur to me, I don't think it occurs to a lot of people, that they're human beings and they obviously have bias. Every human being has bias just by interpreting something in their own brain. And so why should I not question those interpretations as someone who's living in modern day Canada, for example, and trying to, you know, reconcile the realities that I experience every day?
You mentioned, you know, putting out the call out to Muslim women in all these disparate places and getting, you know, really enthusiastic response. How many did you, you know, were you able to kind of source? I mean, to pare down, let's say, you know, 50 stories to 6 is not an easy task.
Yeah. So I didn't limit the conversations I had. Anybody that wanted to have a conversation and tell me about their life story, I was open to that. And so I spoke to, like, I don't know, maybe like 30 people about what they were experiencing. And so some would come to the preliminary meeting and just straight up tell me, you can't use my story, it would ruin me, or, you know, I'd be kicked out of my family or whatever it is, but I do want to talk to you about it. And so those couldn't make it into the book, obviously. And then I wanted to make the stories as potentially encompassing as possible. So I wanted to reach different, or I wanted to feature different socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicities, sect affiliations. There's multiple sects in Islam, and essentially just so that it's more complete for anybody that wants to read it and be able to connect with it, and not just stories about Saudi Arabian Arab women, for example. And so that kind of structured the book and who was able to make it into it. And then some people eventually pulled out also at the last minute. Like I had 3 people that at the end, I don't know, maybe like one was after an entire round of edits with my editor, 10,000 words a page, 10,000 words for the chapter gone because they just, it was too dangerous. Even though I used pseudonyms, it would have been too dangerous for them. So the 6th here are what's left from all that trickling down.
Now you spent, several years writing this book. Did the process change for you? And, by that I'm asking, did you go into the project thinking it would be one thing and then realize it was becoming something else entirely while you were writing it?
I think I came into it with some, preconceived notions about how I thought it was the optimal way to be a Muslim, for example. And then I realized that I was doing the same thing that, let's say, the Muslim patriarchy was doing, which is creating a box and saying that everybody should fit into that box. And essentially it was that there's a lot of talk about how you're either a good Muslim and you pray and fast and you do everything, or and stay a virgin, or you're not a Muslim. And that binary thinking was sort of at the back of my mind because I grew up in that kind of understanding of it. And then it turned out that every single person I spoke to loved Islam. They love the faith. They have no desire to leave it. They don't, want to create their own version of the religion or whatever. They are Muslims. They love Islam. They follow the tenets. They want to be Muslims, and they just need it to open up a little bit.
And I think this sort of next question kind of ties into that. This one's from Chester Madrazo, and he asks, how do you believe that the colonial and political histories have impacted the way people understand sexual ethics in Islam?
Yeah, of course. I think that you can't deny the fact that immigration and just like movement from country to country isn't going to affect the insular notion of a community and their religion and their the faith that the rules that they apply and all of that stuff. And that, like when I was growing up in Morocco, I didn't question these things. It wasn't something that crossed my mind because everybody's doing the same thing. And if they were having sex or doing things that were against, let's say, the basic laws, they were doing it behind closed doors. They weren't talking about it. And so the movement of, first of all, having the French control Morocco and colonize it for so long, brought in like French influence and, the French way of romance or what have you, and all of those things. And then people like me moving to Canada or the US and then coming back in. Of course, those things affect what we as Muslims view as sexual ethics and what should be permissible or not, and what we would like, how we would like to live.
Now, in your interview with Broadview, you mentioned that you gave the people profiled sneak peeks of their sort of portraits. That's that has a very practical reason, which is you want to be able to protect them and their stories. They're going on a limb for you, but you also mentioned that you wanted it to be this very collaborative process. As a nonfiction writer, do you see this becoming a common thing for you moving forward? Is this something you want to dive into in another book in a few years' time?
I think that the way that I structured the book also demanded that type of collaboration. Each chapter is the story of that person, that woman, or that trans person. And it was also the first time I spent, like, was it 5 years working on something like this? I was telling my editor, I was like, if I just stuck to writing magazines, I would have written a ton by now in 5 years, right? So it became all encompassing in some ways and consuming. And I didn't feel right going into a marginalized community to begin with, and then also one that I belonged to, and taking what I needed and just disappearing and doing what I wanted with it, even though, you know, it was just reporting. And when I spent a month traveling to visit all of them and do other in-person interviews across Canada and the US, and oftentimes I was sitting in their apartments or their houses, on their couches, like they opened their doors to me to be in there, and they trusted me. And so it was important for me to allow them, not to allow them, that's the wrong term. I wanted to remind them that they had agency and that they could either pull out whenever they wanted, and tough luck for me. And they could also participate by saying things like, it wasn't just, oh, this is too revealing, someone can tell it's me. It was things like, oh, I was actually wearing a red dress, it wasn't yellow. And that kind of made me laugh because I'm also a fact checker. And I was like, that's fantastic. We just solved a problem, one of the fact checking problems right there. So, but at the base of it is that I couldn't sleep often thinking about doing them further harm than was done to them by just existing in a specific society.
And I think we have time for one more question. I wanted to ask, how do they think about the book? Are you still in contact with the 6 people profiled?
Yeah, I am. Well, one of them, Iman, is the only one that uses her actual name. She's a Palestinian lesbian comedian who's married to a Jewish woman. They're quite popular. And she was very happy to use her name. So she loves it. She was at the Toronto book launch, and she did like a comedy bit. She is also comes along with me for like, for example, there's going to be a CBC The Current segment, and I was like, I'd love her on board. So she's very excited about the entire book and how I portrayed her. And I've gotten a couple other comments from the others who said it's interesting to see their lives written in a lyrical way, or like a beautiful way, as you know, because like when we think about our lives or tell our own stories, they're never edited, right?
Exactly. Well, Sheima, I'm glad your hard work paid off. I'm glad you were able to tell these people's stories, and I'm also glad that it seems like it's doing very well. You know, you mentioned the CBC. It's, you know, making a lot of waves here in Toronto, and I can't wait to see the book sort of branch out across the country.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And our next guests are Jonathan Dyck and Josiah Neufeld. Jonathan is an illustrator, designer, and cartoonist whose graphic novel Shelter Belts was published by Conundrum Press last year. Josiah is a journalist and fiction writer in Winnipeg and a regular contributor to Broadview. They both wrote Unquiet in the Land in our latest issue, which highlights a Mennonite community near Warman, Saskatchewan, and their successful campaign to stop a uranium refinery being built in the community. And as if that weren't fascinating enough, they've presented it as a very colorful, very striking sort of mini graphic novel. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan and Josiah.
Thank you. I think I'll say a few words, then I'll hand it over to my friend and collaborator here, Jonathan. So I'm Josiah. I'm in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, and as mentioned, I'm a long-form journalist. I like telling nonfiction stories that have a narrative shape, and I've just written a book that will be out in about 2 months' time. It's called The Temple at the End of the Universe, and it's about climate change and how people of religious faith and spirituality are responding to the climate crisis. And it's also a personal story. So my writing, as you can probably imagine, intersects with other things that I do, such as I'm a community organizer and a climate justice. I'm involved with climate justice activism here in Winnipeg. And so sometimes my writing and my community organizing work intersect with each other. And this is one of the instances where I was thinking about, the story of the resistance to this uranium refinery in Warman, Saskatchewan in the 1970s. I heard about it a few years ago, people talking about it. I'm from a Mennonite background myself. So, I heard about this story, and I was looking for stories that would inspire church folks towards more political activism. I think among my people, Mennonites, there's often a hesitation to get involved in politics or community organizing, and there are some historical reasons for that, which I can go into, but I won't right now. But I was doing a lot of work with community groups and thinking and feeling like churches and other communities of faith are sort of untapped potential in terms of getting involved in the political work of climate justice. And community organizers are looking to move the public on an issue. They don't look for they don't try to move individuals. They try to move existing social blocks. Community organizations or groups or nonprofit organizations. And churches are existing social blocks, people of faith, people who care deeply. And so I started looking for stories of people of religious faith getting involved in the messy work of politics for a good cause. And that's when I started thinking about how this story could be a really interesting one to serve as a model for us and an inspiration of what could be done. And it was a story of a win, a political win. We don't have enough stories of wins. I think a lot of people who are involved in activism and organizing, we're often struggling against huge powers for the right reasons with little hope of victory. And sometimes we need stories of what it looks like when it works. And this was one of those stories, which is another reason why I was so drawn to it. So it's not a story about climate justice per se, but I feel like there's a lot of parallels. And another thing I liked about the story of this community in Warman, Saskatchewan, was that it's rural. These are farmers largely who were involved in this resistance to this uranium refinery. And I live in a city, a small city, but a city. And I think there's often this, rural urban divide. And so that rural setting really attracted me to it. So as I was thinking about writing this story, I thought, how cool would it be if it was a comic instead of a block of text, which I write lots of blocks of text. But so that's when I got the idea of approaching my friend Jonathan here. We talk a lot, we collaborate, we read each other's stuff, and I thought, hey, it would be cool for us to work together on this. So we started talking about what it would look like to do a collaborative project, some comics journalism in the tradition of the greats like Joe Sacco. So we started working on it together, and maybe I'll pass it over to Jonathan to say a few words about how that worked out.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Jonathan, and I'm a graphic artist, which in my mind encompasses illustration, graphic design, and cartooning. I do all three, and they all overlap in various ways. I'll just jump back a little to 2018, which is when I first heard about this story. It was at an academic conference that's open to the public here in Winnipeg, at the University of Winnipeg, a Mennonite Studies conference that people like me who've started to nerd out about Mennonite history have been attending for years, and I've been going to this conference for the last 5 or so years. But they had a panel discussion on with members of the organizing group from Warman related to this story, and I'd never heard anything about it before. It was kind of shocking to me because you know, these Mennonite groups from very different political backgrounds, more conservative, more quietistic, but also more progressive Mennonites, other groups of people from the area, they all managed to organize themselves around a common goal. And they used different kinds of strategies to mobilize each other and to get people engaged and to convince each other that this was a cause worth fighting for. And in particular, the question of pacifism became really, really instrumental in bringing people on board. The connection between uranium and nuclear war was a really live one. And it convinced a lot of farmers, conservative Mennonites who wanted to stay away from politics, that the development of this refinery was connected to peace. And so that really shook me, because at that same time in 2018, in my home area of southern Manitoba, which is around Winkler, Enbridge Energy Company was working on a replacement pipeline called Line 3 that was moving through the territory. And I saw the Mennonite agricultural community I grew up around not really raising the issue or just discussing the issue with any real concern. And that contradiction really struck me. And this story helped me imagine, you know, another kind of possibility for that reality. So that's where I first heard the story, and Josiah and I had talked about it a little bit before the comic was made. But it was a really interesting challenge collaborating. This is our first time collaborating on a piece together, and luckily Josiah is a very skilled researcher, a very thorough journalist, and I got to you know, use some of my graphic skills, but also imagine this what is a story with not very much action, kind of more like a, I don't know, like a slow burning drama.
Yeah,
when I turn back to you,
I think the comic format, you know, we were limited to 6 pages, and so we had to distill really 5 years of community organizing into this 6-page comic. So you know, that was a challenge in itself, figuring out what scenes to pull out of this work, which in a lot of ways is there was a lot of, you know, meetings and putting up posters and talking to people. Not all of it was, you know, dramatic, not all of it was scenic. So we were trying to figure out how to tell that story in 6 pages. So there's a great document out there that lives on the internet, as far as I know. It's a book-length manuscript written by a researcher who was commissioned by, I believe, Mennonite Central Committee to write about this whole thing. Her name's Gail McConnell, and so I think it was written. The book was researched and written, but it was never published. I'm not 100% sure why, but it's on the internet in PDF format. So I read through this book, and Jonathan and I looked at it, and we kind of were looking for scenes, like what are the scenes that are going to tell the story in a really powerful way, and for characters. Mm-hmm. And you know, one of those characters is Nettie Wiebe, who we interviewed and a number of times, and did lots of back and forth with her working on this. An amazing person, real voice for you know, sustainable agriculture. She's done a ton of really good work around food security in her life, and she was a young woman when this happened, she was one of the people who discovered the connection, who found out that this was going to be a uranium refinery when people from, this developers started coming in and buying options on this land. They weren't saying what it was for, and she was one of the first people who kind of found out, did some sleuthing, and found out what it was going to be for, and played a key role in that community organizing. So it was pretty cool to talk to her and yeah, figured how to tell this long story in 6 pages.
And she provided, along with a few others that we interviewed, provided some really great photographs and other resources that I could draw from visually. So I was working from photographs. I tried to capture some likeness where it made sense. Some of the attire of the time, the 70s clothing, as best I could. But it was also exciting to think about working in color. If any of you have seen my my graphic novel Shelter Belts, it's black and white, which is its own challenge and its own fun. But imagining something colorful, which is of course another way to make this comic without a lot of action into something a bit more visually engaging, was a lot of fun to do. And I was grateful that we also got to sequence the pages so that we could have that sort of penultimate spread. If you see it in the magazine, you see on the last, or the second last pages, this full spread of the hearings where community members voice their concerns, and it's the climax of the story. But it was something that right from the beginning, Josiah and I thought, we really wanted that to be to kind of be a dominant part of the story. So thanks to Carol for guiding us along there.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fun read too. I mean, you have those sort of opening panels of the refinery people, has that kind of 70s paranoid thriller kind of feel to it. Jonathan, you mentioned being shocked that you didn't know enough about the story. The story wasn't sort of like common knowledge. Why do you think that is? How has this story not have a Canadian Heritage Minutes short film made of it? I remember reading an early draft of it and was shocked that I hadn't heard of this.
Well, I think part of it comes from the fact that the political landscape has changed a lot since then. These kinds of areas are not well. There's a bit more conservatism, and I think that these stories have been forgotten, in part because of generational transmission. Maybe their generation didn't pick them up, but also these rural places, I do think, get forgotten by the mainstream, and it's important to retrieve these kinds of stories and to revisit these times. So yeah, it struck me too at the academic conference I was at that this story hadn't received more attention. I did, in some of my research, find that the Canadian Mennonite, which is Mennonite Church Canada publication, had covered this story in the past. But it turned out that some of the people who were involved in this this campaign were actually a degree removed from Josiah and I. So someone we both attend the same church, Mennonite church, and someone we know from that church, his dad was the pastor in Warman. So we had all these connections we could make, and it was amazing to realize that this story was just there right under our noses.
Now, Josiah, you mentioned that at its heart, it's not a climate justice story, and yet it's difficult to not make that connection too, right? Especially now when we see organizations taking on governments, right? Not just corporations, but entire countries. What do you think contemporary environmental groups can learn from the folks from Warman?
Yeah, well, as Nettie says in one of the panels at the end when they're celebrating their win. She says, you know, we as a little group of citizens, we took on, you know, a powerful corporation and the provincial government. You know, the provincial government of Saskatchewan at the time was fully behind this uranium boom, and the local governments. You know, the lot of the, you know, Reeves and mayors in the area wanted this to happen. So it's really a grassroots story of concerned citizens taking on some powerful forces. And so I think that's something that the climate justice movement can draw some inspiration from. You know, we've got a lot of work to do right now in terms of climate justice in Canada. And it's a moment, right? We have a moment now because you know, a just transition is finally something that our politicians are talking about, and the just transition that they're putting on the table isn't nearly ambitious and serious enough to get us where we need to be. And that's where, but it's a start, right? And people are talking about it and thinking about it in a new way. And I think this is exactly the opportunity for, you know, citizen groups and churches and, you know, religious communities of all kinds, mosques and synagogues. You know, I'm part of a little organizing group of communities of faith here in Winnipeg that are pushing our city on its climate plan. You know, this is the opportunity for everybody needs to be getting involved in this, and communities of faith are well situated to do that, to do some of that work. So that's why we made the story, to inspire people.
Well, I think that is a great note to end off on. And that brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you especially to Carol, Sheima, Jonathan, and Josiah, who volunteered their time to make this event possible. We are very, very grateful to you. Following the conclusion of tonight's event, I invite those who are interested to remain on this call for a more informal, casual discussion time. Tomorrow, we'll be sending you a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about this event. Broadview's online reading clubs are free events, but it does cost us a chunk of change for a Zoom plan that can handle a group event of this size. If you're already a donor to Broadview, thank you so much. Your donations help Broadview continue to feature exceptional people like Sheima and hire fantastic writers and illustrators like Jonathan and Josiah. And if you're not a donor, please consider making a small donation for tonight's event. Meredith will post a link for donations in the chat, and we will also include a donations link with tomorrow's survey. After the event ends, you're welcome to stick around. Our speakers may or may not join us. Otherwise, thank you again for being here, and hope to see you back here for our next event on June 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern, where we will be discussing some of the stories from our June issue. Good night, everyone, and be well. All right, everyone. We actually had a few questions for Carol's story in the chat that maybe we can sort of share to the group. One from Ron Getz, and I was surprised to hear this too, Carol. Ron asks, did I hear you right that one of your instructors at OCAD talked about his days in the Hitler Youth with his class? That is outrageous. How could he get away with this?
Yeah, whenever Ernst would start to talk about his very memorable and joyful days with the Hitler Youth, all of my friends, I was the only Jewish person in the class, would swing their heads around and look at me, wondering what was going to happen. It was really shocking. And I didn't feel like I had any recourse because I was worried that Ernst would fail me. I know that wouldn't happen today probably. But as a, I hate to say it, as a child of survivors, when these things happen, like, you kind of freeze. You're a bit of a deer in the headlights. So.
Let's open it up to the table. Does anyone have any questions for Carol? Just feel free to unmute and ask ahead. Did anyone have any particular favorite stories from the April-May issue that they wanted to chat about?
Oh, Robert, I have a question for Carol.
Oh,
and for
sure.
Broadview.
Mhm.
I was just wondering how we could campaign to get the Holocaust and genocide into the Ontario curriculum for high school students. It used to be possible back in the 80s, but it really, very, very few students take history. It's no longer a compulsory subject past grade 10.
Mhm.
Wow, that's quite shocking to hear. History is so important. So Alan, to your point, I mean, I can't speak to the Toronto School Board, but I have a lot of friends growing up who went to, I guess it would be Catholic school, parochial school, and the parochial schools do an amazing job at teaching world religion. I find that knowing things about other religions, how, what they're about, learning people's differences ultimately makes the world a lot smaller, and brings people together. Likewise, there is a group that I mentioned called Facing History and Ourselves. They provide curriculum. They will come into schools and they will provide curriculum to teachers, so that teachers can use time. Maybe they're teaching a sociology class. You can find a way of bringing the curriculum to a class that aligns with what you want to teach. And it's not just about the Holocaust. It's about indigenous, our indigenous peoples, and Black and brown peoples, slavery. It's a very thorough learning and teaching plan, Facing History and Ourselves. So check it out.
Yes, I'm a member of Facing History and Ourselves.
Yeah,
I'm
so
familiar. Yeah, the real challenge is helping people find places to get it into the curriculum.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Right. We'll talk again later.
Okay.
Sorry, we have a question from Vic Weeb from Regina.
Yeah, Carol, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can't help but think a little bit about what's going on in Israel now, and what's happening with the Israeli to the Palestinians. And I don't want to in any way, shape, or form say it's equal, but it bothers me when I see a dominant population overwhelm, I guess, or I don't know what the terminology is, a displaced population. And I just wonder if you have any kind of comment about how that makes you feel, or how I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. I'm very sympathetic to the view you expressed, but I also have a lot of concern what I see happening right now.
Yeah, and I, Vic, I hear you. I'm very concerned as well. The way the current government operates, I had to say I blame the British. For those of us who know history, it was the British who partitioned that land. Both the Jews and the Muslims are native to that part of the world. We both that land is ours as a collective, and it's how the British basically divided that country. So it's very, very complicated. I won't go into it, but yeah, I hear you.
Could I ask a question of Carol? It's David Lee.
Hi, David.
Hi. I'm wondering if you could go back to the Hungarian angle.
Yeah.
Hungary, I don't need to tell you, is a very particular country.
Yes, it is.
It does. It's. I think the word unique is not out of place, and that makes it very different from the rest of surrounding Europe, and indeed other places as well, but particularly there. So I wonder if you could give us the Hungary spin. What
I
do you
would be
think?
thrilled.
Yeah. What do you think? What are some of the key elements in that uniqueness that come to bear on this discussion?
Well, Hungary is Hungarians are a very unique culture. They're not connected to any of the other countries around them culturally with a common language, they're extraordinarily proud and very nationalistic because of this, and always have been. And it was when the Germans, when the Hungarians allied with the Germans said, well, here, why don't you take all of this land? It should rightfully belong to you. So the lands that were formerly Transylvania, and part of what is now Ukraine and Slovakia, they went under Hungarian rule. So Hungary expanded its land by something like a third. It was much, much bigger. And that allowed that changed the relationship of those people in those countries, because now they were dominated by people who decided that they didn't want those people there anymore. They wanted to own that land without those people. So the Arrowcross, who were the Hungarian fascists, were very eager to help the Nazis out in terms of keeping that land. And it wasn't until literally the Hungarians realized they were not going to win that war. That the Germans were losing, the Russians were coming in, and the Hungarians were in big trouble, that they said to the Allies, "Hey, we've decided to change sides. We're going to help. We're going to back down." And it was way too late at that point. So, the Hungarians continue to be their own worst enemies, in a nationalistic sense. And let me tell you, I still have family in Hungary. I still consider myself, a Hungarian Jew, and it's really hard to reconcile that relationship, because, like I said, I have family who served proudly in the Revolution and the First World War. So sorry that was a very long answer, but thank you for asking, David.
Are you still a Canadian as well, Carol?
I am a Canadian, and I will always be a Canadian, Alan, even if I am living in the States.
I have a question for Carol.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. In your article, you talked about your mom choosing assisted death. And I was a little surprised when I read it, because I thought, with everything she'd been through, but I'm a cancer survivor, but I know initially I remember thinking, would assisted death be something that I personally would want to choose? And I did a bit of research, but I was sort of then to do more research to find, say, from a Christian perspective, what that would roll out for. So for your mom to make that decision, I was just curious, unless it's too painful for you to talk about because your mom has passed.
No, not painful at all. And I think it was a good question. Because it was my grandmother, Elizabeth, who chose assisted suicide. No worries. Elizabeth was quite old. And she had also been diagnosed about 5 years prior with cancer.
Oh.
And I have a very good sense that it had spread and she was in a lot of pain, and there was really nothing that the doctors could do for her. And she felt very firmly that she wanted to go her way. She wanted to be in charge of having a good death. She didn't want to suffer, and she wasn't going to suffer any more than she needed to. And in the hospital, I asked my mother, I said, how does this work? She said, it was quite a long time, several months of social workers saying, why do you want to do this? Is this really what you want? And, she was compelling enough, her case was compelling enough that, she was given access to those drugs.
Okay.
If there aren't any more questions, I think we should call it a night. I think it's been a great reading club. Thank you so much, Carol, for staying behind and answering these lovely questions. And thank you so much, everyone who has attended.
And thank you for a great issue.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your Monday and have a great week as well.
Good night, everybody.
Good
Night.
night.
Good night.